The wayfinding landscape is changing, so welcome to Endpoint's Wayfinding Xchange Podcast. We want to connect with leading experts, tech innovators, and key contributors to exchange knowledge and innovation in physical and digital wayfinding. We want to shape the future of wayfinding through discussion, collaboration, and shared expertise. And this is why we have created this podcast series. Enjoy the episode.
So, hello and welcome once again to the Wayfinding Xchange Podcast. This week we're talking to Ian Street, the Managing Director of About Access. Ian's a member of the National Register of Access Consultants and the Access Association. He works with the British Standards Institute to advise on appropriate designs for buildings and their environments. And he's also advised English Heritage on matters of accessibility. Ian travels around the world advising and teaching about accessibility, as well as carrying out hundreds of detailed access audits. So hopefully we'll have an interesting conversation about where access and wayfinding cross. So thanks for your time today, Ian. Where we normally start is we're in this funny little world. I know wayfinding is very much a niche world, and I'm sure access is as well. So we're always interested to find out your journey and how you got into the world of accessibility and access consulting.
Right, yes. Well, I started out my working career in the family business, which was fish and chips. And we had 4 shops, and access was not on the agenda at all. My late father, he had a heart condition, had triple heart bypass. I lost my dad. My mum remarried, stepsister with very complex needs 24/7 care. The family business was decided to sell that, and I was approached by a pal who was a valuation surveyor, valuing houses and commercial properties. And at this time, this is going back to around 2000, the DDA, Disability Discrimination Act, was around. And there was identified then there was a need for businesses to be accessible. And Richard said to me, he and his business partner were going on a 2-day course. Did I fancy going along to understand more about accessibility? And if we thought it was viable, we'd set up a business doing access audits. Well, me being naive, I thought, well, I knew about disability regarding my dad, my stepsister. So I said, yeah, I know all about disability. Yeah, let's go along. Let's see what happens. And I went on this 2-day course and I found it absolutely fascinating and realised I knew diddly squat about accessibility. And that's how it started. And for the first year, I don't think we got any clients or very few paying clients because nobody understood what access was. It was all new. And the work we did do, we generally did for free, purely to build up a bit of portfolio and all the rest of it. And that's how we started.
Brilliant. So you've had some real world experience of commercial buildings and access issues. I think that's an important part to start on a journey, And it was the same for us back when we started in 1999. Accessibility was definitely centre stage. Like you say, I think DDA was introduced 95, but I think there was some requirement by 2000 for businesses to, sort of be getting their ducks in a row. So much of our early work centred around clients changing and updating their signage to align. There always used to be this word about, I need to comply with DDA. And I remember at the time, it was like, I don't think there's any such thing as complying. I don't think there's a body that's going to say you comply. So it was all quite confusing. I mean, before we get into a bit more detail, I mean, could you give us a little sort of quick history lesson on the regulations? Because I know DDA is now, it was submerged into other regulations. We now have got the Equality Act. We've got Building Regs Part M that have a big chunk of accessibility. Can you just give us a little holistic view on the whys and wherefores of the actual legislation?
Right. If we go back to the DDA, which was the founding piece of legislation, that, like the Equality Act, is not a specification document, doesn't tell you how to design anything, doesn't even tell you where to go and look for anything in terms of designing. What both pieces of legislation did say is that you should not discriminate towards disabled people, and where there's a physical feature, reasonable adjustments should be made. And that is where we're at today. By the way, just as an aside, I just get on my hobby horse occasionally. I will look at plans that architects are submitting and they'll talk about a DDA toilet, or let's get a DDA expert in, and all the rest of it. And I just find it so annoying and so infuriating that went in 2010 with the Equality Act, but people still talk about it. Yeah, I know it still applies in Northern Ireland. They still have the DDA, but certainly here in England, Scotland and Wales, it's Equality Act. Then on the back of that, we've got building regulations, and in particular Part M, which also does reference Part K, which deals with stairs, ramps and all the rest of it. But if anybody doesn't know, the building regulations more or less come in two parts. You've got the regulation itself, which if you look at a building regulation document, you've got a green table in there that says what the regulation is and what you must achieve. And that is very high level. The rest of the document is purely guidance and only one way in which you may achieve what the regulation requires. And this is where British Standard can come in, because you might decide that actually I don't like what's in ADM in the approved document. We're going to go down the line of the British Standard. And the British Standard covers an awful lot more detail than the building regulations do. So that's where we're at. The other thing is, with just to differentiate between the ADM, Approved Document M, and the British Standard, ADM is concerned with new build and extensions and the things like that, new build, whereas the Equality Act isn't bothered about the age of the building. The Equality Act is only concerned with how you deliver that service, and that physical features should not discriminate towards disabled people. And where they do, you need to make reasonable adjustments to remove, avoid, or alter those particular features. So that, in a very small nutshell, is the difference between ADM and British Standard. And again, just quickly, British Standard is not a legal document, it is only guidance.
Interesting. So do you find, I mean, obviously clients, concerned with being on the right side of the law. Yeah, so actual regulation is, most of it's guidance, but there are regulations. The building regs are regulatory. There's some bite to those.
Yeah, so going back to the building regulations, if you're a new build or an extension, and certainly with a new build, you would have to meet the building regulations. With extensions, you may have to, generally you do. You've got to meet what the regulation, which is very high level, which in a nutshell, and I'm paraphrasing here, M1 will state that you've got to make a building that is accessible and usable by disabled people. And that is as high level as it gets in terms of the regulation. The approved document to the regulation tells you how you might achieve that. And it clearly states that just by meeting the guidance in the approved document does not mean you have met your duties under the Equality Act. And frequently, clients will say to me, what we're doing here, does this give us a fully accessible building? Does this ensure we meet the Equality Act? And my simple answer is no. Because the British Standard is only guidance, and that the Equality Act is not a specification document, doesn't tell you how you design a building or where to go for that guidance, you cannot meet, in terms of physical features, the Equality Act, which a lot of people are wanting to do, business operators, owners, building developers, because they want to stay on the right side of the law. And it's like you can't have a fully accessible building because disabled people come in all shapes and sizes. You can get two people with the same impairment, same condition, and they might want different things from the environment. You take signage, for example. You get two people with impaired vision, and their viewing distances could be totally different. So it's not a case of one size fits all. We just have to design and be as accessible as is practicable in the scenario that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's where you come in the role of access consultant. I remember again back in the day, it was more you sort of had to be seen to have considered all these things, and like you say, have done as much as you can that was practicable. That famous old word, which I'm sure keeps the solicitors very busy. So in a way, I guess that's where your industry has been born out, is giving this sort of specialist advice, making sure that all the parties involved, from architects to developer to other consultants involved in the design, are putting accessibility or considering accessibility at the point of design, and trying to be as accommodating, I guess, as possible to a broad range of disabilities. So again, I know it's interesting you mentioned the signage element. There was a guide, it is available, the Sign Design Guide. I think if you go on the Sign Design Society, you can order it there. I don't exactly know when it was published, but it's quite an old document now. But basically, this document for us in wayfinding and sign design area was sort of the main manual for some guidance around how to design signage that was legible. Like I say, that document was probably produced 20 odd years ago, and I guess things move on, and maybe this is a conversation for the sign design industry. We work on projects, and often our scheme is there's an access consultant involved, and we end up either sort of collaborating or negotiating or having a little ding dong with the access consultant about our scheme. I mean, what's your approach to assessing a signage scheme, and what are your references from your experience? How does that process often go with not just wayfinding sub-consultants, but I guess you get involved in lighting, landscape, all sorts?
Being a northerner, at times I can be pretty blunt. I looked at a scheme. I was brought back to a scheme that I first looked at pre-pandemic. It was shelved. The staff at this particular venue, they've all moved on, they've all changed, new set of staff come in, and it's been revamped. And they've just not taken any notice of what I originally said in the initial review of the scheme. And in this scheme, they'd put all the accessible seating in one location. And I just said to them, you haven't looked at all at what I've said in the past. You've bunched everybody together. They don't have the same view as the rest of the audience that are coming to this venue. Why are you doing that? And I was perhaps a bit sharper than I should have been, but I just thought, you've had it all before. You know what you're doing because you're already doing it in other parts of the venue. So it can be pretty blunt at times. But I think you need to be, otherwise people, they don't take it seriously enough, or they don't understand what you're saying. But coming back to, if we just stop with signage, for example, what am I looking for? Does it make sense? That is the first thing I want from when I'm reviewing a sign design. Does it make sense? Is it logical? And I look at it from a proofreading exercise, that how many times have you written an email and you've read it before you've sent it, and as soon as you press the send button, you think, no, did I really say that? I've spelt that word totally wrong. And I think signage is like that the designers develop a signage scheme, they put it up, they know what it means, the building operators fully understand it, but there's a couple of arrows at, say, 45 degrees, and they get confused with the staircase that's nearby. Does that 45-degree arrow mean you go over there to the left, or does it mean actually you take that staircase up there to the next floor up? And it's those kind of things that I'm looking for. I will read the signage literally. And I'm also looking at tonal contrast. Is the signage obvious? Does the text contrast with the signboard? This is all very basic stuff, and this was in the Sign Design Guide. Can you clearly view it? Where are your decision points going to be? If you're putting a sign at a decisions point, you're going to have people standing there. What does that then mean to the rest of the people using the building? Are they all colliding? And not always are these things taken into thought. And it's about using that customer journey, the visitor journey. How do people move through that building, through that space? What happens when they're coming to a sign and they've got to stop and read it? There is a great conflict at the moment. I do work internationally. And if you look at the ISO international standard and the European standard, they both recommend that on handrails for stairs, there is braille and tactile information. Now, BS 8300, the UK version, makes no mention of that. And actually, I have a preference that it is not provided, because I can only see it having issues. And the work we've done with the client, they're a global client, they've offices, manufacturing facilities all around the world, and they want a worldwide global standard for access. So we've said, well, why not adopt the ISO, the international standard? And then they've then got this issue around put information on handrails for staircases. And we're saying, well, actually, we shouldn't really be having it for reasons that can people read it? Which direction is it read in? What happens if people suddenly stop on the staircase and there's other people coming up behind them? There's all sorts of issues, but they're coming back to us saying, but you said we should use this standard. So where are we going to go? What are we going to do? And so you do get conflicts, and it's how you manage those. With that instance, we've said to them, put it out to your staff. Let a user group decide what you're going to do, how you're going to provide the information, or what information you're going to provide. And then you can work from there. At least then, by doing that, if anybody ever challenges, you can turn around and say, well, we did put it out to our staff, our disability community, disabled community, to ask them what their thoughts are. Because one of the dangers with that is that me being a sighted person, I'm developing a response for non-sighted people. Do I know what I'm talking about? I don't have to use that braille. So therefore, you're better off talking to people that do have to use it.
I mean, that is it's a really interesting point. I mean, we work internationally as well, and everywhere seems to have different standards or no standards. And there's the whole issue around braille and braille usage, especially in local languages. I guess the thing is, there's no right or wrong, is there? It's almost like we've got to do the best we can. I mean, interesting about the handrails. We work for a large tech company, for American based, and we actually have to supply the little handrail tags that go underneath the handrails now in certain locations. So it is really it's a bit of a minefield. It really is. I mean, talk about minefields. I read with interest. You've done some work with English heritage, and again, I find, how do you deal with the challenges of heritage buildings and almost conflicting legislation? You're not able to touch this fabric because of X, Y, and Z and certain legislation, but obviously on your side there's accessibility issues. Again, how do we deal with that?
Again, I find heritage buildings quite difficult, because with heritage buildings, it is generally 2 + 2 doesn't always equal 4. And I think it depends who you're talking to and what they really want to preserve, what they think that certain things should not be touched. I take the view that I think buildings have always altered. Even if you go back to, 12th, 13th, 15th century buildings, something like that I'm sure within a few months or a few years of them being built, they were altered. So why can't we still alter them this day and age? I'm not after destroying the fabric or the character of the building, because disabled people still want the character of historic buildings. And I think it's about sorting out a customer journey, making customers aware of the access issues so they can make an informed decision when they arrive, and then start thinking about using technology. Or it might even be a case of handrails, for example. You do something totally different with handrails than you would normally do, but you're still providing a means of support. And if you can't make an area to an historic building accessible, well, let's do something else with the interpretation. Let's go down the using technology, augmented route, or virtual reality, or using something like that. Or if it's a church, for example, and they've got a tower that they do tours up to, you're never ever going to put a lift in there, you're never going to make it accessible. Well, at least let's have some pictures of what you see up there in the very basic form, even if you can't do a video. If you can't use your smartphone and take a walk up the stairs and hold your smartphone and take the view around and put it on a TV screen or something. There are things that we can do, but it's about talking to those that have got a vested interest, the stakeholders. I've just recently worked on an iconic building, and I've given them advice about how to make it more accessible. And in this instance, I've suggested that the railings at the front of the building, that why don't they contemplate moving them forward and putting a ramp behind it so it's partially hidden, but they've still got the railings. They would still have the step at the front door, but they've got a ramp with an alternative route for people who can't manage the steps. Now, I know there's going to be an awful lot of stakeholders who are going to roll their eyes at this and all the rest of it. But my argument to that is, if in St Paul's in the centre of London, we can now have a ramp up to it, why can't we with other historic buildings? And it's about setting the scene, setting the standards, and giving examples of where we are making changes to historic fabrics that can be adopted elsewhere.
So I guess part of the headline there is get creative.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what it's about. Thinking outside the box, thinking of different ways. And there's no reason why you can't do that.
I mean, it's interesting you come on to that because I did want to ask because we see it sometimes. I mean, I think sometimes it's about selling the benefits of certain things rather than just being on the right side of the law. Especially around things like health and safety. It's like for years contractors moan, but actually, if you start seeing the benefits, that there's less downtime for people off ill or injured, there's less insurance, there's loads of benefits beyond the legal requirement. I mean, what do you see the main benefits and advantages of like a well-considered, accessible building experience over a less well-considered, beyond just the legal obligations?
I think if we think of the workplace, I think it is now widely recognised that diversity adds value to a business, particularly in the product, in terms of the products and how they work. But there's also another benefit in that staff feel much happier and attitudes change when you have a diverse workforce. And particularly if you're thinking about disability in its widest forms. So not only people with obvious impairments, but people who are neurodivergent, for example. They all bring different skills. They all add value to the business, and people are happier working in environments where you have a mix of people with it. I read a report the other day, an article that some university in America had done a study around this about having disabled people in the workforce. And one of the things that they'd noticed was that in a complaints department, if they employed disabled people to handle the complaints, that they got a totally different response from the people who were making the complaints. It seemed to just de-escalate everything and make life easier for everybody and get results sorted for the person that's making the complaint and the business. So there are things that we should be doing. And disabled people, some of the myths around disabilities, that disabled people are scroungers, they're lazy, they take more time off than anybody else, and all those kind of things. But I know, particularly because of the field I work in, number of disabled people that run their own businesses, and they run them very successfully. And they're not just one-man band businesses, they're employing tens and twenties and hundreds of people in the businesses. And it does make a big difference. And disabled people can and should do everything that everybody else does in life.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, we did a project recently in Scandinavia, and they call it universal design there. It's this idea of being able to design for the broadest cross-section, basically. I think that, for us, the earlier that thinking is involved in the design process, the more it's ingrained in the final solution. But the reality is, it takes nothing away from the experience. In fact, it can even add to the experience. And like you say, if there's a universality or a more diverse range of customers, staff, etc., then that can only be a good thing.
So the other thing I was just going to say is that making places more accessible helps non-disabled people. You think of families out with pushchairs, elderly people going shopping. If you make places more accessible, you just make it easier for everybody. There's a shopping centre not far from me, and they've got about 5 or 6 entrance doors, all double doors. But one set of those doors are powered. But it's surprising how many people always use the powered doors and not the manual doors. I would think a good 75% of people use the powered doors.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we always try and look to the future on this podcast. So it'd be interesting to hear what you think the future is of accessibility, inclusion, and maybe what technology might play in that future. I know you've mentioned a few things already, which sound pretty interesting.
I mean, one of the big things that's happening is that readers of Braille are falling off. There aren't that many people that read Braille now. There's various numbers running around. I was told the other day there's around 80,000 people reading Braille. Somebody else told me it's around 100,000. And that is due to the smartphone, because that is making life so much easier for a lot of blind and partially sighted people. And the apps you can put on those. I'm a member of an access group here in Hull, and was looking at some plans one day, and the text on the plans was very, very small. And Enid was there. She said, I'll get my smartphone out. And she had an app on the smartphone that was able to have a look at this small text and read it out aloud. That could read it, but none of us in the room, and I'm not visually impaired, none of us in the room could read it. But that worked. So, I mean, that's one example, and the apps that are developed, and obviously there's wayfinding, beacons, and everything else. But augmented reality, virtual reality, talking about inaccessible historic environments, that is where that can come into play. That brings in a great benefit. And the other thing is 3D printers. They can help enormously doing 3D plans for buildings, or doing 3D design of, say, a fancy cornice in a building that's up high, and people can then touch it and have a look at it closer. So there's things like that can be used and bring great benefits. And who knows what's around the corner?
Yeah, I know. Technology moves on at a pace, and it's always hard to predict. But yeah, I think, like you say, I mean, we've had a few people on the podcast actually, specifically trying to design smartphone apps that are just totally designed around navigation, and particularly navigation for the visually impaired. Super clever stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think this subject is often seen as quite dry, and sometimes there's a bit of rolling the eyes, but I think that the upshot is, the more people that can come to your building, have a positive experience, good for revenue generation, good for the rest of the community. So I think, like a lot of change, and I guess this is relatively new, we were talking about early 2000s. I think we're all seeing the benefits now, and the advantages of building more accessibility into buildings. So long may your good work continue, Ian, and thanks for your contribution today. And if anyone wants to get in touch, we'll leave your details in the details below on the podcast. But what's your website address, just out of interest?
www.aboutaccess.co.uk.
Brilliant. There you go. If you need any help, phone Ian. All right, chap. Thank you very much for your time. And it's one of those, again, where I think we could really hone in on some fine detail. I know, our designers here, there's a huge amount of research they do into the latest academic research. We do lots of user testing. So when we, like you were saying earlier with the signage issues, about the strategic approaches, the hierarchy of information, the size and legibility of different typefaces, it's all stuff that is for us day to day in our operation. So when we come across access consultants and we have to collaborate with them and discuss our work, it's usually a very two-way experience, actually. So hopefully we'll be able to work with you one day on something.
Hope so.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time, Ian.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our latest Wayfinding Xchange podcast. Stay tuned for further episodes, and feel free to contact us with any questions and suggestions for future episodes.